Thank you, Mark, and thank you, the Water Institute, for hosting me here today. I promised Mark that I would show some kelp forest videos in this talk, so I figured I might as well start with one right away. And I think this video sort of encapsulates some of the beauty of the underwater world, and I think a lot of people here, when they think about the underwater world, they think of kelp forests like this, where you can see a beautiful school of blue rockfish. This is a location just south of Monterey Bay. You can see some understory, lots of invertebrates and whatnot that live underneath there. We think of coral reefs. We think of these pristine underwater environments, but we don't really think too much about the physics, or at least I know there's a big applied math group here that does, but a lot of people don't really appreciate the beauty and the complexity of the underwater world when we think about the physics. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that underwater world, but a lot of my problems will tie back into how do we study this, physics problem with all these different ecological and biological implications. So a quick outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about what lies beneath, so what we see there in that biology-motivated video, but also from a physics perspective, how do we know? I'll introduce this idea of internal waves so we get everybody on an even playing field. And then I'll talk about sort of the fate and implications of these features in relatively shallow waters. And I was told this is a relatively interdisciplinary group, so I have different ecological, biological, as well as more of the sort of applied math type of problems for different categories and different interests. This is a picture of my coast. This is actually Cal Poly's pier that you see right here. It used to be an old oil pier. It's actually in 10 meters of water. That photo on top is taken looking down at that embayment. This is San Luis Obispo Bay. And again, I think a lot of people can appreciate the ocean, can appreciate things like the Great Lakes for a lot of their intrinsic beauty when we see photos like this. And we tend to think about the ocean as this sort of wide, homogeneous expanse. And if you were to look at that, you would say, oh yeah, or the layperson might look at that and say, all right, well, it seems to be relatively homogeneous and not a very dynamic environment. Well, that is actually very far from the truth. This is that same exact embayment, and this is showing a sea surface temperature photo as measured via satellites. And so just to put this into perspective, here we are on the Central California coast. This is the Santa Barbara Channel right there. We have Point Conception, the Channel Islands right there. And then we also have things like San Francisco Bay, which is right over here, Northern California, where basically nobody lives, and then we have down to Southern California, where basically everybody lives. And so this is showing the same environment. Those pictures I took you before, I was standing up over here looking down. And what we can see here is we have these different temperatures, these different water masses. And these are ubiquitous in the ocean, these things where we have this delineation between different water masses. Here you can see this nice, what we call a front, between this warm water mass in the bay. This cold water mass, this is actually upwelled from the deep ocean. And then you see this warm water mass that's been pushed offshore right there as well. And so these fronts are ubiquitous up and down the coast. Along these fronts, we also have strong gradients in various biology parameters, so things like chlorophyll, the various populations, the various larvae that live within those different fronts or along those zones. And oftentimes, if you look out into the coastal ocean, you'll see these lines and these slicks where things tend to accumulate. We can have velocities that come together in the form of a convergent front. We can have these processes underwater that drive these areas where the water is coming together or pulling apart, what we call convergences and divergences. And a lot of these fronts drive a lot of the biogeochemical cycling within the coastal ocean. So they're also really interesting from a physics perspective because we have such a rapid change in a lot of the different properties, namely density as well as the velocity. If you go just an hour or so south of here, this next image I was going to show you is from the Santa Barbara Channel, and it's going to show you ocean currents as measured via high-frequency radar. So we have these different stations up and down the coast. I run 9 of them along the Central California coast. These send out a radio wave. They bounce off the surface of the ocean, and you can get what the surface currents look like over time and space. So you can see up there in the top, this is every hour. We see a snapshot of what the ocean currents are doing. The ocean is this very dynamic, evolving field, both spatially and temporally. And this is actually a simulation of a somewhat major oil spill we had on the Central California coast, 140 plus gallons, so 4-ish liters in a gallon. I know I'm in Canada now, so I have to have my right units. And so this is May 2015 off the coast of Santa Barbara. And this is a simulation of what happens during this oil spill and how this oil field evolves. You can quickly see that oil gets swept into this eddy and quickly eventually makes its way over into the Channel Islands area. And you can see how complex and how dynamic this flow field is on the surface of the ocean. And so this is what it looks like on the surface, and if you dive down below the surface, we also have a similarly complex and dynamic flow field as well. And so this is showing these measurements made in Monterey Bay. I'll get back to Monterey Bay a little bit later and talk a little bit more about this system and this environment. And so here's Monterey Bay right here. This is Santa Cruz, about an hour north of San Francisco. The Monterey Bay Aquarium and Cannery Road, the beginnings of a lot of John Steinbeck books, are down there in southern Monterey Bay. And there's this long meandering canyon that goes all the way close to the edge right here that I'll talk about a little bit later. And this is a transect where they actually have these underwater vehicles that swim along this path, and they go up and down in these various patterns. And we can get these snapshots of what the ocean looks like, not only across the horizontal space, but also in the vertical plane as well. And so this is a slice showing the horizontal, this is the vertical dimension here, and this is showing temperature. And we can see here, we can still see things like this front where we go from warm water right here to cold water right here. But we can also see even greater variability, or rather variability that happens on a much smaller spatial scale. So in the horizontal dimension, we see this variability on the order of kilometers. In the vertical scale, we see these rapid changes on the order of meters and sometimes less. And so when we start to talk about the vertical, we have to take into account these differences in temperature and other water properties. So we oftentimes like to simplify things with our cartoon ocean. We have a top layer that we say is less dense, typically warm, typically fresher waters. We have this bottom layer that's more dense, typically cold, typically salty waters, less dense or lighter, more dense, heavier. And in reality, it's some continuous distribution where we have this top layer, we have some sort of region where that density rapidly changes that we call the pycnocline, and then we have some bottom layer. So the ocean's broken up into these different layers based on this density stratification. So as an easy example, I've taken unsweetened iced tea right here. This is actually one of my former colleagues, Dan Witt, and simply lemonade. And so we have basically water and sugar. If you pour those in carefully, you can get this nice stratified body of water that sort of mimics what happens in the ocean as we get this layering of different densities. So the stratification has a lot of important properties. You can think of it as sort of putting a cap between these two layers. That stratification provides a restoring force for any vertical perturbation, so it tends to dampen those vertical perturbations. And we can quantify this with things like the buoyancy frequency, basically a simple harmonic oscillator problem. If we perturb a more dense particle of fluid or parcel of fluid up there, it wants to go back down, and it will oscillate at a certain frequency that's prescribed by the background density gradients that we have within the ocean. So we can also have things where this density stratification can also support waves. And so if we perturb this in the right manner, we can actually generate waves. And you can see not the waves up here on the surface that you're accustomed to seeing in the ocean and in the lakes, but these waves that actually propagate along the interface or along the pycnocline, or what we call the waveguide between those two different density fluids. And so this is what we will refer to, or I will refer to, as an internal wave. And you can see it oscillating those two stratification layers along this pycnocline region where we get the change in the two. And so that's what we'll refer to as an internal wave, and I'll talk a little bit about those within the context of oceans. And of course, you see these in lakes. You see these in estuaries as well in some cases. Here's a bunch of different images of these internal waves. You can actually look at these from space via these SARS images, and these basically almost more or less look at the surface roughness, and you can see these areas where we have alternating rough and smooth bands. These are driven underwater by these alternating convergences and divergences in the velocity field. This is an example. These are some examples. This is one from the East Coast, and you can see underwater these waves that are perturbing these different layers with these oscillations. This is an example from Monterey Bay. Mark and I, some of our work, and you can see oftentimes these waves come in these big packets where we get these big waves followed by progressively smaller and smaller waves. And of course, we have lots of other interesting things that are happening in the trailing end of these packets. And so this gives you a form and flavor of these different types of waves. They can grow to be absolutely massive. And so there's a paper that came out in Nature a few years ago. They were in the South China Sea measuring these waves, and they measured waves that had amplitudes of 500 meters with static instabilities, or these waves that were breaking with these instabilities that were greater than 200 meters high. So to put that in perspective, this is our double Eiffel Tower right here. It's about 600 meters. This is the CN Tower right here. I changed it up since I'm close to CN Tower, which I hope to see on Saturday. But you can see here that these waves are absolutely massive. This wave, if it was a building, would be the 5th largest building in the world. So these can get absolutely massive. Of course, this is an extreme case, but certainly these waves have the ability to get, in 20 meters of water, I've measured waves that are 15 meters tall. So they can occupy a large portion of the water column as well. They happen in the atmosphere as well. Here's a really beautiful image. This was taken from a NASA MODIS satellite. This is the Prince Edward Island. This is a couple, about 1,000 kilometers, I believe, off the coast of South Africa, right in the Indian Ocean. And this is a little island that sticks out about 1,300 meters above the sea level. And these are actually, you can see this banding that you get within the clouds. And so just like in the ocean, you have these internal waves. In the atmosphere, we can also have these waves. And as these waves push the atmosphere up and down, we can get areas where, as we get that rising air, we get adiabatic cooling. That eventually will condense and form a cloud. As it gets pushed down again, we get adiabatic heating, and that will lead to these alternating patterns of cloudy, clear, et cetera. And you can see it in this pretty striking image within the atmosphere right there. Okay, so really briefly, I want to go over just a quick crash course in the life of an internal wave. Most of the focus of my research is on the demise or the death of these waves as we reach the near shore. But as a quick overview, we can start with the generation of these waves out in deep water. So first of all, the ocean is not like a bathtub. A lot of people think we have the continental shelf and land, and we have the ocean, nice big bathtub. That's very far from the truth. We have all sorts of underwater features, bathymetric ridges, underwater mountains, and in some cases are steeper than the mountains we get on land. And so once we have this stratification, and we have these underwater features, and then we have the tides moving these things back and forth over these underwater features, we have the potential to generate these waves. It's one mechanism amongst many, but this is certainly probably the most prevalent and common. So this is a little video. This is an animation from Tom Peacock at MIT highlighting the internal wave generation in the South China Sea. This is a Luzon Strait. We have these steep underwater ridges that go very close to the surface. As we have that stratification, those different density layers, and we get the tides moving back and forth, we get the generation and propagation of these internal waves. These waves tend to be relatively slower and lower frequency than surface gravity waves, but just like surface gravity waves, these have the potential to propagate hundreds to thousands of kilometers, and they evolve until they eventually reach the nearshore region. And in a lot of ways, I like to say they wreak havoc on the nearshore physics and biology. So we have the generation, and then we have the propagation. So these waves start to evolve, and a lot of folks here in the applied math department, Kevin Lamb, Merrick, and others have looked a lot about the mathematical evolution of this with these so-called KDV-like waves, or these solitons. And so this is an idealized simulation from the South China Sea. We have this underwater ridge, like that last video. We have the tides going back and forth across this ridge. This is showing density, so we have less dense, more dense. And you can see these waves as they evolve, or as they form and they evolve, they almost look like they're fixed and they're locked, okay? So these waves are tending to want to steepen. They're wanting to generate higher wave numbers, but they're also wanting to disperse based on their wavelength. And so when you have a balance between that steepening and that dispersion, you can get these fixed forms and these solitons that form and propagates in somewhat of a fixed form for very large distances. And again, a lot of people here have been very instrumental in a lot of the original development of some of the mathematical description of that in these sort of KDV and other extended forms of the analysis of that. So you might ask, well, why do we have all these videos of the South China Sea? Well, as a quick little, I'll promise I'll be a minute or two aside. The United Nations Law of the Sea prescribes the exclusive economic zone. It says that 200 nautical miles from a coast, a country has the rights to access drilling, mining, et cetera. And so the South China Sea happens to be this coalescence of all these different countries, all with the rights to these different areas, oftentimes with these overlapping areas. China claims an historical claim to that. I'm not going to get into the politics, but we have 6 countries 11 billion barrels of oil annually, 10% of the world's fish catch, and about 30% of the world's maritime trade that goes through this region in the South China Sea every single year, and that's the equivalent of about 5.3 trillion USD. So why do we care? Well, it turns out that these internal waves affect the propagation of acoustics, and if you have submarines out in the South China Sea, you're interested in how the acoustics and how we detect these submarines, and these internal waves can immensely affect our ability to detect these submarines. So just to give you an idea, this is August 2014, what used to be a nice, beautiful reef and started being an atoll. Then we see December 2014, the exact same reef, and June 2016, the exact same reef. So we went from there to there to there in about 2 years, and this is the case across many of these islands in the South China Sea. These islands, there's a great little article, China now has cruise missiles on what started as a fisherman's shelter in the South China Sea. I believe as of a couple weeks ago, they landed their first bomber on one of these islands, and of course it's a highly contentious issue happening across international borders. So in terms of the life of an internal wave, again, this is going to be the focus of my research, sort of the breaking and dissipation. Once these things break, how do they affect a lot of the nearshore physics and biology? And so just like a surface wave enters a beach, it starts to shoal, starts to steepen, eventually breaks and develops these instabilities in the swash, as we call it, that rushes up the beach face. We can have internal waves that as they encounter in shallow and shallower waters, they also steepen, eventually break. You have these beautiful instabilities, and you get this slug of cold or deep, dense water that's rushing up the slope and what I will call the internal swash. And so this is what I will also call as an internal bore. It's the remnants of this internal wave that has propagated, entered shallower water, has begun to break, and is now rushing up the near coast with this trailing edge of turbulence and also all the biological properties of that deeper ocean water. Okay, so why do we care about the nearshore? Well, in a lot of ways, this is where we have our main connection with humans. So over 50% of the world's population lives along coastlines. We have some of the coastal ecosystems around the world, kelp forests, coral reefs. Most of the world's fisheries are located in these coastal regions. And also we have some really interesting physics. We have a lot of nonlinear processes. We have a lot of complex things going on as we enter shallower and shallower water. So today I'm going to share some little stories about why we care about internal waves in shallow systems and some of my past research projects on this process. So again, go back to a cartoon ocean. We have two layers, less dense layer, more dense layer. We have these internal waves that break, eventually form an internal bore that propagates into the nearshore region. Well, it turns out near the surface, we also have lots of light, the so-called photic zone, and we also have lots of these microscopic photosynthesizing organisms that we call phytoplankton. These phytoplankton require light because we have photosynthesis, but they also require nutrients. It turns out that the surface layers are relatively devoid of nutrients. These bottom layers tend to be very nutrient rich. And so in order to form the base of the oceanic food chain, in order to have the ability to produce over half of the world's oxygen that come from phytoplankton in the coastal ocean, we need some mechanism by which we take these nutrients from the deep ocean and we bring them to the surface where we have light. And so also this idea of the cross-shelf transport, how do we transport these different things, these scalars, these properties across the shelf into the nearshore region, where again we have all the interesting organisms, lots of the interesting biology and ecology. And so in a lot of ways, these internal waves in some locations fuel the productivity of the nearshore. We also have a lot of effects that these deep ocean waters tend to be low in dissolved oxygen, and they tend to be low in pH. So these internal waves also on the other side are taking these corrosive and low DO waters and they're putting them closer into the nearshore, again, where you have lots of organisms as well as various shell-bearing organisms. So we want to talk about, well, what are the implications? Do these waves actually do anything? And how do they get there into the nearshore? So I look at my research from a field perspective. And that's not to say that models do not have merit. In fact, I can say a bunch of things that are wrong with field observations. Each of these give us a different look and a different way to study these particular problems. But let me just show a little quick comparison of field scale model versus lab scale models. And again, I know a lot of people here, including Mark, do a lot of stuff with lab scale models, and they get us into a lot of the sort of fundamental dynamics of these processes and these instabilities. So here's a field scale model. This is a 2D model. This is actually from measurements in southern Monterey Bay. We forced it with actual stratification that we measured in the offshore. We forced it with what's called a mode 1, semi-diurnal internal tide. And we let that thing propagate onto the shelf. This is a 2D model. We have grid spacing, delta X in the horizontal 5 meters and the vertical 1 meter. And this is a 20-kilometer long by 80 meters tall domain. And this is the actual scale of the field, including the bathymetry. And so this was run with suntans. In this model, we're able to run it overnight on 16 processors. And so, yes, we are missing a lot of the physics in here, particularly the quantitative aspects, but qualitatively, we can actually reproduce some of the structure of these features. If we go to the lab scale model, this is a former lab mate of mine, Bobby Arthur, and Oliver Fringer, who was his advisor. This is a 3D, what's called direct numerical simulation lab scale model. So this grid is 4 meters long compared to 20 kilometers long and only 56 centimeters tall, has a resolution on the order of millimeters. It resolves all the different scales, so a lot of these fine scale features that we see with turbulence, and produces these beautiful, beautiful images where we can see this wave breaking, all the instabilities that develop, these vorticity fields as it's plotted right here. This was a code that was run on Department of Defense computers, 103 hours on 768 processors for an equivalent of 79,000 computational hours. So, very, very different models and the way we look at this problem. We can get a lot of the qualitative features here, but once this wave starts to break and once it starts to get into this region, again, qualitative is all we can get. This model, we can get to understand a lot of these intimate breaking processes and a lot of the details in the quantitative aspect, but we're limited to these smaller domains and these very fine resolutions if we want to encapsulate all of the scales. And of course, between those two, we have a whole spectrum of models and different parameterizations for how we look at turbulence. So to look at this, I'm focused more on this nearshore region, and I'm focused more on the field scale. And so I take these instruments, these sensors, these perfectly good electronics, and I throw them out into the field, and I cross my fingers and hope they come back because these sensors are not cheap. And so this gives you an idea of what a typical mooring, as I call it, looks like. So suppose we were interested in watching this internal wave and internal bore as it propagates past our sensor array. So this is a fixed Eulerian frame of view. And we have these instruments with these different sensors. We can put temperature, conductivity, which combined with the two of those can give us density. We can put dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll sensors, turbidity, any sort of these parameters that we're interested in measuring, as well as velocity using acoustic methods that we can get velocities at all these different heights above the water column. So we can get these really nice snapshots at a particular place of what the flow field and scalar field looks like. So all sorts of different techniques and ways we can go into the field and measure these various quantities. A lot of my stuff that I do, we go out into the nearshore locations, places where it's shallow enough that we can actually dive and assemble some of these things underwater. I'll show this video of a tower that I assembled underwater later. And we put all these different instruments out in the field, deploy them off of small boats, dive on them, make sure they're set up properly, and again, cross our fingers and hope they come back so that, one, your old advisor doesn't I won't say kill you because I guess this is recorded, but he wouldn't kill me, but he's a good guy. Anyways, so we have this thing, we cross our fingers, hope they come back, and to this day, I have never lost anything really, really expensive, so we'll hope for that in the future. Okay, so let's take a look at what some of these features might look like. So this is from southern Monterey Bay, and what we're looking at is in the nearshore. So this is meters above the bed. This is the bottom of the ocean. This is the surface over about a 3-week period, and I'm plotting temperature where blue is cold and red is warm. And so if we look at this, we can see we have these pretty regular episodic intrusions of this cold water as it starts to come into the near shore. And again, if you look at some of these events, we're talking about a 4 or 5 degrees centigrade temperature difference in a matter of minutes in some locations. And of course, with these temperature differences, we're also carrying all those other biological properties with these water masses. And at this location, this is the dominant driver of variability. These are features that perhaps 20 years ago, we didn't have the sensors and techniques to be able to actually measure things like this. This is not an interpolated field. I had sensors every half meter measuring at 1 second. So that is actually what these fields look like. It's not an artifact of interpolation. And you can see a pretty striking view of how these features drive variability. If you were to zoom in on one particular event, this is looking over the course of about a half a day. So again, we have the bottom of the ocean, surface of the ocean. This is temperature plot on this axis. So we have the front of this internal wave propagating in. We see that first. And then we have the trailing edge. We see all of these fluctuations. And if you zoom in more, you can see some instabilities. We have this cold core as it's propagating towards the coast. In the velocity field, if we look at this, this indicates that this bore is coming onto the shelf or onshore. The water near the surface is moving offshore, so we have the strong velocity shear, which again can drive instabilities. In the trailing edge, we also have a strong shear as well. So these internal waves are propagating. They're coming onshore near the bottom and bringing all of these water properties with them into the near shore. So one of those water properties is oxygen or dissolved oxygen. And so if we look at the same data set, we can look at what the dissolved oxygen looks like with time. So on this bottom plot, I'm showing over the same time period. I have it taken off of there, but this is 3 weeks. We have temperature here in black. We have dissolved oxygen there in gray. So dissolved oxygen and temperature are highly covariant with one another. And you can see that we get these huge fluctuations in dissolved oxygen. We get this period right here where the dissolved oxygen has these small fluctuations, actually drops below this hypoxic threshold based on a meta-analysis that was done of 4.6 milligrams per liter. And then we also have these wild swings where we go through these different periods. And so I'll talk about that in a second. But these internal waves in the waters that they're transporting from the deep ocean have the ability to drive really, really fast drops in dissolved oxygen. So we're going past this hypoxic threshold with very, very quick onset times. And we also have these periods where we have a very long duration of these low oxygen waters. So more sessile organisms might not be able to escape during these periods, while maybe the more mobile organisms may be able to escape when you get these huge fluctuations associated with these internal bores. So if we look at that a little bit closer, what I've done here is now taken approximately a 3-month record. So rather than the 3 weeks I showed you before, I took 3 months of data. And I've windowed it over these one-day windows, calculated the standard deviation of temperature and the standard deviation of dissolved oxygen. And within that one-day window, I've either looked at the mean temperature or the minimum temperature. And so this plot on this axis, if you have larger temperature variability, that indicates you have more of these internal waves and these internal bores that are driving these differences in temperature. And then, of course, we have dissolved oxygen and variability as well. The higher the standard deviation is. So if we look at this, we see a couple different regimes when we start to look at these low oxygen or these hypoxic events. So if you look at the blue values, at least what pops out at me is I see a lot of blue values down here as well as down here. And then I also see some of these blue values over here as well. And so what's actually happening here is during these time periods, these are time periods where the internal waves are relatively weak. And so it turns out that these are time periods when we have what's called really, really strong upwelling. When the wind blows in a certain direction in combination with the Earth's rotation, we get these deep cold waters that are low in oxygen that are actually coming up into the near shore and starting to pool in that region. And so these are the times, if we were measuring dissolved oxygen along the bottom, we don't really see large temperature variability because we don't really have those internal wave features along the bottom. They're propagating higher up in the water column, and we tend to have this pooling in the bottom of the water column. And we also see that these values drop below that hypoxic threshold. Now, if we look at that regime up over here, you can see if we look at the mean over those one-day windows, we don't really see these really low oxygen values. But if you look at the minimum, we definitely see these values that reach below this hypoxic threshold. And this is a regime where the offshore stratification or the offshore pycnocline is actually much lower in the water column. And we tend to see these periods where we have relatively unstratified waters. Then we have this internal wave coming in, breaking this internal bores, crashing up onto the shelf. We tend to see this really rapid change in temperature. So we have a large temperature variability. And we also tend to see a really rapid change in the dissolved oxygen where we have relatively low values that drop below this hypoxic threshold. So from a biologist's point of view, this is really important because the duration of these hypoxic events, as well as the onset time, or how quickly these events occur, is going to affect different organisms in different ways. Okay. So the next little story I want to tell you about is how internal waves might affect larval fish. And some of this work was, some of the original work was done by folks like Jesus Pineda, Shanks, and others. So this is a picture now of the Monterey Submarine Canyon, or this is a picture of Monterey Bay area. So we have our ocean over here, we have our land over here. Here's Santa Cruz, big surfing town. An hour this way is San Francisco, southern Monterey Bay, and we have Moss Landing and Elkhorn Slough right here. And in the ocean, we have this long, meandering submarine canyon that goes all the way up really close to the shoreline right there. So to put it in perspective, the Monterey Submarine Canyon is actually steeper than the Grand Canyon. So it changes by 1,500 or so meters over the course of a small horizontal span. And so that's the Monterey Canyon right there, and that's the Grand Canyon superposed on top of that, so you can see the difference or the relative steepness of the Monterey Canyon relative to the Grand Canyon. So it has this flat shelf, it gets out to about 100 meters right there, and then drops off into thousands of meters over a very short distance. And so this is actually an excerpt from National Geographic, and there's a company called Deepwater Desal that's interested in building a desalination plant right here at the head of this Monterey Submarine Canyon. So California, as many of you might know, over the last 5 or 6 years has gone through extended periods of drought, and so desalination is becoming more and more of a thing. San Diego County just recently built a huge facility in Carlsbad, and this particular company is interested in accessing this canyon water for the potential reason these cold waters coming very, very close to the shoreline. They can stick their pipes out there, and they actually want to partner with Google to build a data center so this cold water goes through the data center, cools things down, goes into the desalination plant, and then gets pumped back out into the offshore. So there's a little excerpt. It was always my dream as a kid to be in National Geographic. I was obsessed with Indiana Jones, so I think this is the closest thing I'll ever get to it. But the plant's pumps would draw very cold water from a, quote, wave that originates in a deep underwater canyon. So we went out and we had over a year of continuous physical measurements. In fact, there's a couple sampling sites, but they're pretty similar. So we went all the way to the head of the Monterey Submarine Canyon, and we put these sensors where this slope starts to drop off. In fact, one of the moorings almost got lost because they have these very frequent sediment events where almost like these underwater avalanches that will transport sediment kilometers over the course of a few minutes. And Barr is doing a lot of really cool work with that. But we went to the head of the canyon, and we had over a year of continuous measurements of the physical properties, so things like temperature, velocity. And they also, a group with Tenera Environmental also went out, and they did over a year of these larval fish tows. So they went out. They had 56 different tows over the course of a year, over all different conditions. And over the course of this experiment, they measured 7,200 individual larvae from 45 taxonomic groups. This is a very, very intensive process, sitting behind and counting these things down to the lowest taxonomic level, or highest taxonomic level. And the idea is we were watching these features, these internal waves, as they propagate in, measuring them right here, and also sampling all of the larvae during these different events. So this is a heavy plot, but basically what it is, it's showing, this plot right here is showing temperature over the course of over a year. And so we can see these temperature changes, these seasonal changes. We also see these really large fluctuations on top of that. Every one of those red lines indicates a larval sampling period. So during these course of these red lines, it's a little bit obscured by this plot, but if you were to zoom in on one of those red lines right there and look at the actual temperature field, this is temperature over the course of a few days, and this yellow line is the actual temperature that we measured at these locations. And then these lines are the larval tows that they went out throughout the water column to measure and identify all these different fish larvae. And so we went through and created this internal Bohr index in these different water properties or periods. And so we define these areas that were below this low-pass filter as the cold regime. So right there and right there would be cold regimes, and these periods that we sampled above that low-pass filter as the warm regime. So in other words, this warm regime is indicative of the ambient shelf water. This cold regime is indicative of these deeper waters that were advected and transported by these internal waves. So we went through and ran a bunch of statistics and looked at these different processes. And this on the left is showing a principal coordinates analysis. If folks here are familiar with PCA, it's essentially the same idea, but instead of using the covariance matrix, we're using what's called the Bray-Curtis dissimilarity matrix. So it looks at all of these different samples, looks at all the different species, and looks at differences in the community composition that are driven by differences in abundance of the species, as well as the actual different taxonomic groups. And so what this is showing, we're plotting the first principal coordinate axis here, the second principal coordinate axis here. All these individual dots represent individual samples, where the red circular dots are the samples that fell into the warm regime, and these were the samples that fell into the cold regime. And then the numbers indicate the month of sampling. And so if you look at this, the first thing is let's look along the principal coordinate axis 1, which described the most variance, 21% of the total variance amongst all the samples. For you physics folks, 21% might not seem like a lot, but in the biology realm, that is certainly a lot of variation for these principal coordinates analyses. Whereas in PCA, sometimes the first mode will cover anywhere from 50 to close to 100% some of the times, or up into the 90s certainly. So here, if you look along this first axis, and let's just focus on these up here. So you can see this clustering where we have the spring and summer months over here, followed by the fall and the winter months over here. And so I don't show it here, but it's in the paper. We went through and analyzed the first principal component and showed that the strongest indicator was the seasonal driver. So seasonality was driving the most variance in these larvae. Nothing too surprising. That's a well-documented thing along California. But along the second principal coordinate axis right here, you can see that all of the warm samples are clustered over here, and most of the cold samples, with some of the warm ones, sampled over in this region. So we went through and ran some statistics on this, and these were significantly different. The cold regime seems to be much, much less than the warm regime. It had about half the densities. It had less taxonomic groups relative to the warm regime. And we ran some statistics using a package called Primer in R to verify these things as well. So this tells us that the internal waves and the internal bores, at least, are one of the dominant drivers of variance at this particular data site and affect the larval fish community composition. So we went back and tried to analyze this by different species. And so what we did is we had all these different taxon, 45 of them. We ranked them from the most abundant to the least abundant. So over there in the most abundant, we have things like the anchovy, we have croakers, we have goby fish. And so these are the most abundant, these are the least abundant. And then we looked at the average concentration between the warm periods and the cold periods, and we normalized it. And so this is the proportional difference. And this shows that all of the warm period samples, at least the most abundant samples, were more predominant in the warm periods. And then we had these sort of middle abundance group that were more dominant in, or more concentrated in, the cold periods. And so we're still working through this data. There's a whole bunch of different fish. A lot of these fish, their larval life stages aren't really well documented or well known. And so there's a whole lot of research that still needs to be done on this. If any fish biologists are in this room, we'd love to hear your opinion and get more thoughts on that. But each one of these individual species has different life stages, has different adult habitats, whether they live in the pelagic environment or in the benthic habitat or close to the shore. And so there's still a lot to tease out from this. But certainly these internal waves drive these differences in abundance and assemblage. Okay. Next little topic I want to tell you about, since we're talking about fish, internal waves in kelp forests. And this is actually my undergraduate student. He just presented this poster at AGU, so this is a lot of his work. And so we have these beautiful kelp forests in California, like I showed you in that first video. In fact, these kelp forests aren't just limited to California. We have these giant kelp forests that are located all around the world. We also happen to have internal waves that are located all around the world. And so it was sort of surprising to me when we were digging through the literature that people haven't really studied the effects of the kelp forest and how they affect the propagation of the internal waves and vice versa. So these internal waves, again, are providing these nutrient fluxes into the nearshore. They're sending these deep nutrient-rich waters, fueling the productivity of the nearshore and things like the kelp forests and a lot of the critters that live inside of them. So we had an experiment where we went out in southern Monterey Bay, which is a well-known site where these big internal waves and bores propagate. And we put out a whole bunch of instruments. In fact, we had over 100 thermistors. Just to give you an idea, these thermistors are about $500 each. 13 CTDs, 8 of these $25,000 ADCPs in a big cabled underwater tower. This is like $500,000 worth of field equipment. It was basically every single piece of equipment that Stanford had in their arsenal, as well as some stuff from Berkeley as well. And we put it out to study this process, and we found this location, which happens to be next to Stanford's Marine Station, where there's this really wide expanse of sandy channel, and then next to it, we have these kelp forests. And so this was a sort of a perfect experiment to go out and look at, well, how do these internal waves propagate through the sand channel, as well as through this rocky reef and this kelp forest in southern Monterey Bay through this big, dense array of instruments. So to give you a little idea, this is actually a video that I took really close to one of those observations or one of those moorings, giving an idea of what these kelp forests actually look like underwater. These absolutely beautiful underwater worlds, and in a lot of ways the real redwoods of California. And you'll see this kelp, the three-dimensionality. They have to occur on some sort of rocky reef. They have a little bottom piece called the holdfast. It's like this sort of root system that encapsulates these rocks and holds onto them and sticks onto them. And so we have this rocky reef, so really rough bottom, as well as a potentially form a drag here within the water column. So we went out, and again, we measured this line going through the kelp forest, and we measured this line going through the sand channel, where both of the offshore sites were located outside the kelp forest, outside the influence of the kelp and that bottom feature. And to give you an idea what it looks like offshore of that, figured get a chance to show you some videos. There's a site out here called Deep Reef. At Deep Reef, it's pretty spectacular. We have these big rocks underwater, relatively sandy bottom, these big rocky outcroppings where we tend to get these metridium, and oftentimes during these big algal blooms we get in the bay there, we get these big fields of jellyfish that come in as well, the so-called sea nettles, as we like to call them, and they absolutely explode for weeks at a time, and it becomes basically impossible to scuba dive through there without at least brushing up against one of those tentacles. So pretty spectacular environment, and we also had a big mooring out at this site right there as well. Okay. So if we look at these features and how they propagate, so these plots are all oriented as before. I just normalized the axis. We have the bottom of the ocean, surface of the ocean. We have time on this axis, so this is showing about a day or so worth of data. Temperature is indicated by these colors over here. So from left to right, we're going from offshore to further onshore. And then as you go across the top row, you're going through the sand channel, and as you go across the bottom row, you're going through the rocky reef or the kelp forest, and I've added some vertical lines that are the same on each relative comparative plot. And so we see here, well, first of all, even in the sand channel, we see the breakup of these internal waves and bores as they propagate from offshore to onshore. They're getting smaller, they're getting shorter in wavelength, and they're starting to break down. But we see that even more pronounced here going across the rocky reef and the kelp forest. And so we don't really actually see the bores at the same location over here as we do in the kelp forest. They've already broken down, they've dissipated a lot of that energy, and this rocky reef is acting to limiting the ability for these internal waves to propagate across the shelf closer and closer into shore, whereas the sand channel is almost allowing this conduit of flow through it right there. We can see the same thing in the kelp forest if we look at the velocity fields. So these are showing cross-shore velocities, and where this indicates a positive or onshore, this indicates offshore velocity. Top panel is a rocky reef kelp forest, bottom is a sand channel. And again, we can see these internal waves. This is a similar time period where we see these alternating onshore-offshore flows of the internal wave as it propagates up and sort of relaxes back down. We can see the second internal wave coming over there. And you can, if you squint a little bit, you can sort of see remnants of the internal wave propagating onshore there, like we see right here. Perhaps some remnants of it propagating back offshore. But certainly these are on the same scale. Certainly the magnitudes are much smaller, and the effects are significantly reduced inside of the kelp forest. If we look at a comparison of temperature in the sand channel to temperature in the kelp forest at the same exact depth, and at the same exact cross-shore extent where we'd expect to see the same temperatures, we can see that if these were exactly the same, they would be right along this one-to-one line. But certainly what we see is something different. We see in the kelp forest, these waters tend to be much warmer than in the sand channel. So for instance, if we go to the sand channel, 12 degrees centigrade, we go up, we'd expect to see it right there, whereas in the kelp forest, the water is actually much warmer. And the colors have indicated a Bohr index, so an index of when these internal waves arrive, where this negative, this is a high-pass filter temperature signal, this negative, or these blues are indicative of the cold waters arriving from the bores. And so perhaps we can see here that what's driving a lot of this signal is the fact that the temperatures difference is enhanced when these internal waves are actually the strongest. And so we see, again, this is separated by just a couple hundred meters, exact same depth, exact same cross-shelf extent, where we see almost a 2 or so degree temperature difference during the exact same time period between these two sites. So again, the rocky reef is sort of shielding these cold waters from propagating inshore. We see those cold, deep waters propagating in the sandy channel, but we don't see the same thing in the reef. That potentially results in these much warmer temperatures in the reef, particularly during these internal bore forcings, and it sets up these alongshore or lateral gradients in temperature as well. How are we doing on time? Is it 45 minutes or an hour? Okay, so I'm going to skip through this really quickly. Basically, what we did is we went through and we looked at the sand channel relative to the rocky reef, and we did the comparison, looked at the spectra, and we found this really interesting thing where this period of right about 10 minutes, we saw this almost an order of magnitude difference between the spectra during these different time periods. These different colors indicate the relative bore forcing. So for weak bores, those were pretty similar. For strong bores, there was a much larger difference. And it's these sort of 10-minute period oscillations and internal waves that we get that are occurring in the sand channel, but we don't see them within the kelp forest. And then if we look at the cross-shore and alongshore velocities, I'll skip over the data, but go to the message. So here's back to our original diagram. We have the rocky reef, we have the sand channel. So these sand channels allowing the strong cross-shore flows. The rocky reef is inhibiting those cross-shore flows. If you look at the two sites, one site here, one site there, both of those have similarly reduced alongshore velocities. Not surprising, we have this alongshore flow, which is inhibited by the kelp forest. If you look just offshore, we have much stronger alongshore flows. And so these kelp forests are acting like this big drag element and reducing the ability of these internal waves to propagate in the cross-shelf direction. So that's a little form and flavor. Again, he's an undergraduate student that did most of this work, and he's still working away on that as well. So last but not least, internal waves and turbulence and mixing. We have this cartoon ocean. How do we get these nutrients from there to there? And have these other scalars as well. Well, if we look at an unsteady temperature diffusion equation, so temperature evolves in time based on this vertical diffusion, and we scale that out, we can get a diffusion time scale of roughly L squared on D. So if we take 10 meters as a vertical scale at which this diffusion has to occur, we take molecular diffusion for temperature. That tells us molecular diffusion takes about 31 years. So something else is happening. Molecular diffusion is really slow, it's really inefficient, and we can't rely on that for mixing within the ocean. That something else is turbulence, this sort of complex flow field that a lot of folks here have studied in various realms. And to give you a good visualization of what this turbulence looks like, I like to look at this image. This is a two-layer stratification, so we'll have stratification, more dense waters, less dense waters. We've put some seed in the flow down here. We've shined a laser with this oscillating mirror to produce this laser light sheet, and you can watch as we take, Sean Batusik and others take a garden hose and actually just put it into the flow. So this is his music. So good easy. Anyways, so we have this beautiful flow. We have the stratification, which tries to dampen out some of these motions. You can also see this turbulent jet, this beautifully complex flow with these coherent structures. If we were able to dye this room, we would see all of your breaths and these beautiful turbulent jets coming out and entraining oxygen into that plume of CO2. And you can sort of get a sense for this flow. It's ubiquitous in nature. Warren Heisenberg, famous physicist, once said, when he dies, he's going to ask God two things: why quantum mechanics, or why electrodynamics, and why turbulence, and he believes that he'll have an answer for the former, but not the latter. So this is a very active area of research. Lots of research has looked at the effects of internal waves and stabilities. Kevin Lamb had a really nice annual review of fluid mechanics a couple of years ago for the grad students in here. I'm assuming all of you have read it. If not, shame on you. But it's a really nice overview and some of the outstanding questions and areas of research to move off into the future in this work of instabilities. Here's a beautiful image of this internal wave taken off from from Jim Moom at Oregon State. And you can see these beautiful roll-ups we get in the back end of this instability. These are what Kelvin-Helmholtz billows, one of many, many types of instabilities that are still an active area of research. And here is, I think, one of the perhaps the most beautiful demonstrations of this in the lab that I've seen. There's some others, but two-layer tank, stratified fluid in red, or more dense fluid in red, less dense fluid in clear, tilts it, and you can see the beautiful formation of these really nice billows that form along that interface as you get these differences in velocity and this enhanced shear. And they'll show a zoom in on this in a second. This is sort of eye candy in a lot of ways. I love this. You can see these things all the time in the atmosphere if you're looking for them. So again, we can see nothing's really happening. Molecular diffusion is really slow, really inefficient. And then you get these beautiful roll-ups right there, and it goes off into this fully turbulent field and has enhanced mixing. So we went out and tried to understand this, and we went to the same location. This is a lot of my dissertation work. And we went out and put this cabled observatory out there. We put an 8-meter tall underwater tower. So this thing was hard enough to assemble on land with these big groups of people. It took us 8 different divers over the course of a full day. I think we did like 4 or 5 dives each. And we had these big teams of divers that went out and assembled this thing underwater. And this thing was cabled to shore. It was outfitted with all sorts of instruments. We had these ADVs that were point measurements of velocity at 64 hertz. We had fast CTs that were measuring the same sampling volume that were also measuring 64 hertz. And we had all sorts of instruments and things outfitted on this tower as well. And again, this thing was a beast to be able to actually put together underwater, where we have waves, we have currents. This was actually the best visibility that we ever saw during this experiment, which is why I show this video. Most of the time, you couldn't even see the other dive teams because of all of the soupy mess because of the strong productivity of the California currents. So that gives you an idea. And we were watching as these things were coming in. We have 2 weeks, over 50 gigabytes of raw data, which allows us to answer some pretty interesting questions about turbulence, and more specifically stratified turbulence, which a lot of these different quantities, if you look at the TKE evolution equation right here, a lot of these quantities are notoriously difficult to measure in the field, particularly this quantity, the buoyancy flux, which looks at correlations between turbulent density fluctuations and vertical velocity fluctuations. There are other ways to estimate things like dissipation, production, and other experiments, but that was sort of the big one that was unique about this one. And you can go through, and long story short is we can revisit this idea of how do we look at vertical diffusivities. The common assumption is that we typically take the mixing efficiency, which looks at the TKE loss to raising the background potential energy, and the TKE loss to dissipation by small-scale strains, and looks at this ratio, what we call the mixing efficiency, to parameterize this diffusivity. So a lot of models go back and assume that the Flux-Richardson number, or which is related to the mixing efficiency, is constant, but we found something very different from that, and I'm running out of time here, so I'll keep going on. We found these internal bores drive these really big changes by several orders of magnitude of these different turbulent quantities. Go through there, and we also looked at the fact that, well, we can't really assume, at least in certain environments, we can't really assume that RF is constant. Now, there's a whole class of flows out over here where RF goes to a constant value, but certainly for these high buoyancy Reynolds numbers, or Gibson or turbulent activity numbers as we call it, these flows, you can't really assume that constant value. Otherwise, you're going to be significantly overestimating turbulence and turbulent mixing. So I want to start with, end with this slide, a little famous Dr. Seuss quote that I've changed a little bit. And I like this picture in the top left corner because it shows a picture of Mars and a picture of our planet. We know more about the surface of Mars and the features on Mars than we do about the bottom of the ocean. So the ocean really is the last frontier. In the United States, we have NOAA, which is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. It's our sort of ocean and atmosphere funding body. We also have NASA, which funds a lot of the air and space. NOAA's budget is about 1% of NASA's budget. So oceanography, atmosphere is a relatively understudied field relative to some of these other things. We used to take pictures from the atmosphere, from the air, looking with these pigeons with cameras. There's these old pictures during World War I where they were trying to take these pigeons to fly over these battlefields to look at the army and the soldiers getting together. Now we have the ability to look at all sorts of interesting features from space and get these beautiful snapshots of what the horizontal variability looks like on the surface. This is one of the first major oceanographic expeditions, 1874, the so-called Challenger mission. This is actually the mission that they discovered Marianas Trench. It was a multi-year expedition. They lost, I think, over half the crew members on board, but discovered all sorts of new species. They used to drop these weights down to the bottom to measure depth. Now, of course, we have more sophisticated instruments. We have autonomous vehicles. We have a whole network of floats floating around the ocean. And so the questions we're answering as computers evolve, get more powerful, simulations, we can make them bigger. And as field scale instruments over the last decade, we've seen this explosion in the ability for us to measure the ocean. Instruments are smaller, faster, can sample longer, and we're answering lots of new questions and really moving into a new frontier of how we look at and study the ocean. And of course, we need all its different aspects. We need laboratory, we need numerical, we need field, because every one of those different aspects, or the triad of environmental fluid mechanics, as I call it, is really critical and important, because every single one of those has a gap that the other one is trying to fill in. So I think there's a lot of great work that can be done in the future, a lot of outstanding questions as we scale up models, as we get more sophisticated field measurements, as we tie these two together to say, hey, like the model's saying this, the field measurements saying this, how do we come together to say the same thing? I think there's a lot of exciting times ahead of us as we move into this last frontier. And so last but not least, I'd like to thank some of the funding bodies for this work, as well as a whole host of contributors, including some undergrads and former lab mates, as well as current and former collaborators. So thank you for having me, and again, thank you to the Water Institute and Mark for inviting me.
Thank you for a great talk. One component not mentioned was sediment. I immediately think about sediment transport or sediment suspension. What kind of role do the internal waves provide for that? Because we often think about surface waves and that swash, but subsurface wise, what's the role and what's the signature it leaves so you can recognize that the impact of the internal wave in the nearshore? Yeah,
so it certainly plays a large role. In fact, Mark and Kevin Lamb have had some numerical simulations looking at that. There's been a lot of field measurements of that. There are some groups out of Monterey Bay, the USGS, and Moss Landing there that have made these measurements. So as these internal waves come through, you can see these really nice measurements. We can look at turbidity. We can look at the echo intensity from these acoustic signals. We can look at optical backscatter or turbidity. And we can measure these things. And you'll see during these big internal waves, we actually have sediment resuspension events. We can also generate along a slope. If you have this internal wave coming in, it will resuspend sediment locally, and you'll get these what are called nephloid layers or intermediate nephloid layers, where you get these big bands of sediment that are coming out into the interior of the water column. So they do play a critical role in certain areas, particularly for some of these large events. And yeah, again, there's a lot of numerical work going on here at Waterloo about that, as well as field observations from around the world looking at this process. So yeah, certainly is a thing, and there's a lot to be learned from it as well in the future. Yeah, and we can measure these, and I can, after the talk, I can show you some references and show you there's some pretty cool field measurements of them as well, and some pretty cool pictures that I think are very, very sort of qualitative, like pop out at you, like pretty obvious what's happening. Yeah.
Great, do we have anyone else?
So these waves propagating up the stand channel and then through the kelp forest, can you measure the residual currents or the net transport and how different it is?
So like in terms of the Eulerian versus the Grangian and like the drift? I haven't done that, but certainly it's been a, so Cal Poly is an undergraduate institution, and we don't actually have PhD students there. So this has been a student's project. He's been working on it for a year, but he puts in a couple hours a week type thing. And it's one of those things where I have a list this long of things we want to do in terms of what to calculate. I actually want to do the energy balance because we have that tower out there. So there's a lot of cool things we can do, and certainly that's a great suggestion.
How do the internal waves differ in the Great Lakes versus the ocean coast?
That's a great question. I mean, certainly you'll have similar forms of waves. Lakes, you tend to get lots of what are called Kelvin waves, but certainly you'll see similar flavors and features in lake systems. But of course, you don't have the salt component. But certainly, temperature provides the density stratification, and you get strong seasonal changes in lakes. And then, you get into the Great Lakes, you get some weird things that happen right around 4 degrees C as the freezing, or as you get the sort of this local maximum in the freshwater density. And so you'll get some interesting features that happen there, and I know Mark's done a little bit of work on that, or some of his students have as well. So, but you'll have similar forms and flavors of the features in the lakes as well.
You had you had the larval abundances for various species, right? And you had obviously some of the larvae liked warm and some of them liked cold. I guess I'm asking, are there more warm periods than there are cold periods, or?
No, they were pretty equally distributed, and
equally
also we
distributed.
ran analysis of variance, and we did some other ecological statistics to account for that difference.
Okay.
Yeah, so that wasn't drastically different. It turned out to be really nice because originally they brought me into that project, and because they were looking at the temperature measurements and be like, what the heck is going on? And that's a location where actually the internal wave is relatively coherent with the surface tides. In southern Monterey Bay, it's basically you can ignore the sort of phasing of the internal tide relative to the surface tide because as those things propagate, they have all sorts of different interference. They have the background currents interacting with it and changing it. And so that's a location where if you go out during a certain period of the tide, you can expect to see the internal tide doing a certain thing as well. It's dramatically coherent, which you don't get in a lot of locations.
Okay.
But it was roughly equally distributed. I don't remember the exact number, but certainly we had enough power to run statistics. And I don't necessarily know that there's a preferential liking of the larvae for warm or cold. Certainly some species do. We think what's more happening is it's sort of this dilution mechanism because we were finding, again, there were 45 different taxonomic groups, and it was really difficult because a lot of these things didn't have larval life stages for them. There was no research or there's no published papers on them. So a lot of them were just sort of like, well, we know that the adult habitat is this, but we have no idea what the larval life stages is, how long it's in the water column, or and these other detailed questions that are necessary to do these life cycle assessments. Yeah.
Okay.
And one other quick comment: if anyone has, if you want some of this data, I'm certainly happy to share a lot of this data with you. So if you have a grad student, you're like, I want to do some of these calculations, or interested in looking at a certain aspect, I'm certainly happy for contact me. I can share data. I'm always happy to collaborate.
Okay, I guess on that note, we can thank Ryan again.